seats.
Be brief. Hello, everyone. We have our second panel today. And then just a quick reminder, following this panel, we have some concluding remarks, and then we have a reception afterwards where you'll be able to engage with the panelists and talk amongst each other even more. And we encourage you and ask you, please stay, please talk. Oh, and we have, you're doing the raffle, and we have a raffle that'll be happening from Type A. Fantastic.
Wait, did we get one of them?
Yes. People will win the, can I say what they are? Yeah, there are some bottle cap openers that were being printed throughout the day. And of course, there is the hand, which is, I mean, if you have a desk, you've got to have that on there, right? So we have our second panel coming up. I'm very excited to introduce. It's being hosted by the research fellow from the Institute for Innovation Law, the Privacy Project, Brian Pascal. The name of this panel is Keeping Guns Off the Street by Keeping Them Out of Printers, which I think maybe 40, 50 years ago, nobody ever would have considered this as a panel, and now we're looking at this in the most imminent way possible. So this is very much on point and on trend, and thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian. Like Charles said, I'm the research fellow with the Privacy and Technology Project, subset of the Institute for Innovation Law. So we already talked a bunch today about biotech and the regulatory structure and the IP issues surrounding 3D printing. And so now we're going to jump over to a much more gritty on-the-ground subject. Let's call it guns, but really what we're talking about is how does 3D printing actually change society on a day-to-day basis? Now, keep in mind, 3D printing is both new and old, and the way it's new is that it takes ideas and makes them real physical things. And if the idea is a gun, that can get dangerous. So here's our general format for today. Everyone's going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes. In between, they're going to have 5 minutes of roundtable where they can ask each other questions, or I can ask them questions. And at the very end, we'll do a little bit more roundtabling, and then we'll do Q&A. Quick intros for the panel. We've got second in from the left is Espen Silverson. He is the CEO of Type A Machines in San Francisco. They make 3D printers like that cool thing over there. He's worked in all manner of areas with design and engineers and architects, and he was in Denmark with Chaos Pilots, and he was the head of demo lab at Innovation Lab. Basically, he's our resident tech guy. We've got Devin Desai, who is a law professor at Thomas Jefferson, and he serves at the Academic Research Council at Google. He teaches trademark, intellectual property, business associations, and information privacy law, and he spent a year as a visiting fellow at Princeton University's Center for Information and Technology Policy. Professor Desai's scholarship examines how business interests and economic theories shape privacy and intellectual property law, and where those arguments explain productivity or where they fail to capture society's interest in the free flow of information and development. Rory teaches here at Hastings and should need little to no introduction, but he has been a litigator, a criminal defense attorney, a prosecution lawyer, and an appellate lawyer. He chairs and serves on various committees in the Bar Association, both American and federal bar, and he publishes to a review of the Supreme Court's term. Let's keep this short, if you don't mind. Did I miss anything important?
That's great.
And lastly, Chris Conley is a policy attorney with the ACLU of Northern California, and he focuses on privacy, free speech, and emerging technology, and he works with both technologists and policymakers to design tools that enhance individual rights and promote civil liberties. Prior to joining the ACLU, Chris was a research fellow at the Berkman Center and editor-in-chief of the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology. And without further ado, Espen, tell us how all this stuff works and what's cool about it.
Okay, great. So can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, sweet. Are there any cops in the audience? No? Okay, don't shoot me. I brought a 3D printed gun. This one actually just shoots pens, and it's not working because I wanted to pass it around so you guys can see what it looks like. The bottom line is that I don't buy the argument that some people in the industry put forward, which is you can't 3D, well, the cost of 3D printing a gun is much higher, and it's much more difficult to do than doing it through, just buying some other stuff at a hardware store or whatever. That's an argument that's going to become, over time, and not immediately, but over time, increasingly hard to uphold as the reason for, not legislating or not not acting on what 3D printers are capable of doing. In the short term, I'm actually more worried about the 3D printed shank, to be honest, because we work a lot with schools, and of course they are very careful about both guns and knives in particularly inner city schools, and you do have safety concerns around that. That said, what we found when working with teachers is that, you know, what's more important for them is to have control of their classroom. And as long as we work with them to ensure that this is a tool that can be used appropriately and in that context, it's not a problem. There's plenty of legislation already in place to ensure that firearms and so on are being handled in safe ways. So again, you know, I'm very wary when I see people wanting to start putting limitations on the industry. As a manufacturer, we of course know more about the technical side, and I think, as you probably heard a bit earlier today as well, trying to put the cat back in the bag at the end of the technology sort of like curve rather than at the beginning isn't going to work, and it's already too late in my mind for that. Part of the thing I wanted to show as well is, like, this is a plastic gun. You trust me, you don't want to fire this with real bullets. It'll not be good for your hand or anyone around you. But we're able to do interesting things now for a fraction of the price. If you wanted to 3D print this with a metal printer right now, you're looking at a $100,000 machine, and the parts themselves would be several thousands of dollars. There are way better ways of creating weapons than that. But we just recently started investment casting, which is you take a 3D plastic part, so say this part here, and you pack that in plaster of Paris, and you put it in a oven, a jeweler's oven or some sort of forge, turn it up to 300 degrees centigrade, and you burn out essentially the plastic. Plastic melts, and you're left with a cavity or a mold. And we can then pour pretty much any metal into that cavity and mold, and you're left with a metal part. So what we're able to do now, and that metal part, that whole process is about $150, just to give you an idea. Right now, if you were to buy this little propeller here, or rather it's an impeller used for pumping systems, if you were to buy that online through any sort of prototyping company, you're looking at probably around $2,000 plus. Most of them can't even do it at that price because every one of these angles is unique. That means you have to do tool pathing for each of those angles. We did it again for less than $100. So, you know, the technology is already there. I don't think it's a question of the technology. For me, it's much more interesting to look at, well, how is this technology going to be encouraged? One of the things that the previous speaker was talking about, and a lot of you guys in the audience were asking questions about, is what are the implications on jobs, for instance? And from my perspective, I actually see that 8% of our customers already have started their own company or are running their own startup using our 3D printer as their primary tool. That's actually better than most business schools. Our customers are generating more jobs and doing more startups than most business schools, right? That's really interesting to me. So I'm less worried about that and more worried about how we take these kind of issues like 3D printed guns seriously without limiting the amazing power this technology has to improve our world. And I think I'll leave it at that for now, unless you want me to.
No, that's...
Yeah, all right, thank you. I'll pass this around. Yeah, there you go.
So, so really it seems like we're getting to this essential tension, which is that 3D printing may not be anything special, because if you're worried about 3D printed shanks, then you're also worried about sharpened screwdrivers.
Right.
So how do you, and like you said, there's a lot of possibility here. So as a guy who makes the tools, how do you make sure they stay a force for good and not just a force for anybody who wants to build bad stuff?
Right. So I mean, I think we were actually talking about this. Our founder Andrew and myself, we were talking about this in the car over, and it is something that we talk about on a very regular basis. You know, how do we ensure that this is a tool for good rather than for evil? And I think the honest truth is that this is a tool that's going to make people more efficient at whatever their intention is. And our goal, our stated goal in our company is very much helping people go from idea to object. We want to empower people to take the ideas that they have in their head and bring it into some form of object. And, you know, trying to control that is going to be really, really hard. because there's just no way that at least we are aware of on the technical side that you can really stop people from 3D printing things. And so I think that the solution that at least we're moving towards is something akin to the iTunes solution within the music industry, where you have large online libraries where people pay for parts or you can download parts. And that doesn't mean that you can't go on, the Pirate Bay or wherever and download other things. It's just that the majority of the mainstream people don't do that because it's a lot easier to go on iTunes and download things. And so as long as we are able to make objects easier to use using the mainstream sources, and then we can kind of do what we from a manufacturing base can do to limit access to guns, for instance, so that you have to show an ID and follow all of this existing legislation essentially within that space, then we're starting to look at something that it's not going to stop 3D printing from being used from evil, but it's going to curtail it somewhat at least. So I don't know if that helps but that's kind of where we're at. Yeah.
So I've got a question for the tech guy, because I don't understand the tech at all. So I'm going to ask you sort of a descending order of questions, or ascending. So you can print the gun. Can you print the bullets? And if you can print the bullets, can you print the explosive or the gunpowder? What I've been told is it's the chemistry of the explosive reaction that is the furthest away from happening. Do you see that happening someday?
No, I mean, you can't 3D print bullets. I mean, you can print the casing, but the gunpowder you have to bring in from somewhere else. So again, there may be features of firearms that you can curtail or control. But people are very, very good at circumnavigating problems, and getting around them. And so maybe the 3D printed gun doesn't fire bullets as they're normally thought of. Maybe it uses a spring mechanism instead of a explosion. You can make weapons really easily. Come on, guys. I mean, think about your own kitchen, right? So I think it's less about the you can make weapons part and more about the okay, well, what are we doing in terms of making it hard for people to just download a weapons file, versus making it hard for people to download anything else. And I don't think you can do that through control. I think you have to do it just through convenience. Because somewhere out there, you're going to be able to find the weapons files. They're already out there. There's a company that does this for a living right now.
Texas, right?
Yeah, Texas.
So that actually raises a question. So it's so how feasible is it to build some intelligence into one of these machines such that it knows so that it actually kind of knows what it's printing versus just taking a cab file in and churning out whatever the cab file says? Yeah. Is that a thing to do, or is that just really hard?
So, I mean, this is the first Wi-Fi enabled 3D printer in its class, right? So that means we're basically printing via browser. So in that sense, you could have a server farm somewhere that looked through all of the objects and made sure that it wasn't anything nefarious before you printed it. The problem then is you either have to have some really, really smart software, which I don't think exists or can be done because people are very good at getting around that kind of thing. Or you have to have some guy that sits there and goes through all of these objects. And I'm pretty sure you don't want me or someone else to know what you're printing, right? So then we get into all kinds of privacy issues and all kinds of things, So I think that there's there are things that people can do in terms of insisting on DRM or measures to protect, and for some purposes it may be prudent to do so. Like at your school, for instance, we can put in a feature that lets the teacher okay the print before it goes to print. So the teacher basically sees the file and he says, yeah, okay, and then that lets the print. We've got the technology to do that.
That's an easy.
That's the easy solution, right. But it requires some sort of oversight, and the question is, do you want that?
Right, and I suppose the other form of oversight would be curation of a whitelist, essentially. Here is what you can print, but that raises its own questions of, well, okay, if the whitelist is no guns or no gun parts, well, there are a lot of things that you can imagine that could be in a gun, but could be in something else as well.
And I think it kills, the moment you do that, it kills the really forceful thing about 3D printing, which is the rapid prototyping element and the customizationable element, you know, and the ability for me, and we're actually going to do this. We've got a whole bunch of different schools and universities around the world, and we're going to have an object that they're going to test for marketing purposes. They can print it out, go out on the street, get market data, market research, go back in, make some modifications, send it to, you know, the next university in a different time zone. They print it out, so Tokyo, you know, and you send it around the world. And within 24 hours, you've got market data on a product that's actually evolved during that cycle from the whole world. You can't do that at the moment, but with 3D printing you can, you know. And it's an amazing ability to really go in and innovate. But the moment you start saying what can or can't be printed, then you've taken away a lot of that ability. And I think you'd see a lot of companies object to that because they use it on their day-to-day basis. Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's
Cool, thank you.
so excellent. We will come back to a lot of these things. I'm sure I'm just trying to get everyone time to say their piece before we dive all the way down the rabbit hole. Devin?
Yeah. So everything that's been said today makes a ton of sense to me. The paper that I wrote with Gerard Maglioca called Patents Meet Napster, as Professor Lemley pointed out, really just was fascinated by the notion of digital things. And as I got into it, a lot of what Espen's been saying, it's nice to hear someone in the industry say, yeah, at least I think if he reads it, he'd say, you got that right. Because what we did was the classic, I think someone this morning joked about, well, we're lawyers, we break things into threes. So suggesting then that there are three basic ways it seems to have manifested itself in terms of there's home innovation, there's startups that are using it like crazy, and there's still a ton of work being done at the large factory level in terms of prototyping. But some of what we're getting at then, and the reason that Gerard and I think that the gun issue is a red herring in terms of it will pose real problems as we'll hear about, but the bigger way to think about 3D printing, and I think it's been said, but I'd like to put in simplest terms, it's a personal computer for things. It is truly a general purpose device. And that's one reason you're seeing it at these three different levels. So when you tell me that 8% are coming to you, that doesn't surprise me because how many of you have heard of Etsy, right? Etsy's huge. So there's some really interesting, huge macroeconomic, microeconomic, political economic, throw economic, whatever you want, but it's going to be a really interesting thing in the next 20 years about are we going to get incredibly distributed and customized goods, right? And that's what 3D printing might unlock. So when you then think through guns, what guns I think end up being is an interesting test case for all the reasons that it's an incredible technology and why trying to lock it down is probably a failing strategy, right? Because the things that happened when this hit the news were a few guys in Texas fired off a few rounds at an AR-15 and, you know, it basically kind of blew up, for want of a better term, right? As he said, don't try and use it in that plastic gun there. And what was interesting to me is some people mocked the effort and said, well, they only fired a few guns. I think a lot of people said they fired a few bullets. You know, it's still a few bullets. But about a year later, went kind of quiet, and all of a sudden they showed up with the video, and they were firing 600 rounds and said that the only thing that stopped them was that they ran out of ammo. So the rapid prototyping, all of these things, whether they did it only in their own or they used a few friends around the world, I'm not positive. But the upside here is that doesn't have to be only a gun. It's almost anything. Now, as I understand it, under federal law, any of us is allowed to make a gun. But the thing is, we need expensive tools. We need lathes, we need mills, and frankly, if you're someone like me, it's not going to work that well. I'm bad with that stuff. So this is where the digitization stuff gets really interesting, right? So the Autodesk folks and others, you can now use your phone in your phone camera to take several pictures, and I think someone's working where you could even do a video, upload it to a free software site that will turn it into a file that you then download to most people are using Blender, another open source software area, so that you can clean up the file and print. So when someone like me, the unfrozen caveman lawyer, can start to do that, it becomes pretty powerful in terms of anyone can do it, right? And that's really the most exciting part about it. Now, the interesting thing is chemistry, well, right now is way out there. There are 2 professors in Scotland, and I checked with a professor who works on this at Michigan State, and he said it's a real paper. It holds up that they have some prototypes to compound chemicals. That's going to be far away, and I think a lot of it will end up being, we're not going to do this at home, because what I described was still I got to clean up the file, still I need the materials, and as they get more sophisticated, I'm better off going to Espen's company and saying, I've got some stuff, I would like to rent your printer for a while. But there are people who might do it at home. And so the most interesting things coming would be, the reason I think it's a red herring is the overreaction, right? The notion, as has been said all day today, that you would try and lock down the operating system or the hardware or even a word processor, right? Oh no, you typed in and you copied that book, right? One of the problems is everyone seems to always go, isn't this really bad for copyright? Copyright, we kind of figured out the wars. They're still kind of going, but there's some balance there. And so one of the things that my co-author and I proposed were a couple little things that are just different, right? The assumptions in IP have always been about cost barriers, to me, very much business to business. So patent becoming possibly consumer level just changes what we need to do here. We might want to carve out, what we suggest is a whole new rethought about, well, what would it be to have a experimental use that made sense? What sort of monetary threshold? Because this is going to happen. And having it be that you could go after everyone like the music industry did and say, hey, we're coming after all of you, right? The lawyer, this file sharing site, all of these people, that doesn't make any sense to us. So we propose, even though a lot of people hate the DMCA, an extension of the concept that if you're hosting files as a true intermediary, until you're on notice, you get to let those files go. What I liked about that, and as a side note, is I don't think the DMCA was as bad as many people because, and it might be a little bit of a hindsight justification, but if you look at YouTube, Google couldn't sit still forever, right? It started to look pretty bad when enough of the music industry went into court and said, this can't be what Congress wants, this can't be what Congress wants. And Google now has Content ID. So what you're seeing is a very interesting moment where the industry players give a digital fingerprint, and if we were to upload a music video of some sort and we use, it's not a perfect match, but insofar as it's identified, the potential rights holder gets to know, and then they choose what to do. And then what Google did was say, all right, you get to either do the notice and takedown, or maybe you monetize it. You put up an ad, or you have a click to buy a song. So old songs that had not been hot but got used in that wedding video, right, where they're dancing up and down the aisles, it jumped back up. One Hit Wonder jumps back up to number 3 and 4 in the charts. Found money. So with 3D printing, you could have a world. Think about all the car parts that aren't available anymore, where I love the idea of the iTunes. We actually argue in the paper that that's the better way to go because it might be better than trusting Professor Desai's wacky version of a file to go to Mattel, to go to the Ford or whomever and say, why don't you stream or download or let me buy the file? And in fact, they might, as Mark was suggesting, and we argue in the paper, sell you quality goods, right? Not plastic from random person, but plastic that meets safety standards. Their brand will actually become more powerful because you're going to them, in fact, to know the source and quality of the file, so you avoid malware issues, design that has integrity, and perhaps even the substances. So I think all of those things as market forces should be more powerful and should be kept open compared to the lockdown that some people might suggest happens because there are going to be potential problems. And so that's the rough area where we break out. And I think basically we agree with Espen that there's so much that can happen in terms of rapid design that if you try and lock it down at its core at any of these levels, I think it would be a serious mistake. I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. So
You agree?
I do, and so I'm trying. The problem is that the questions that I wrote down to ask you, you pretty much answered all of them.
I've got a question for him.
Yeah.
But I got to remember what it was now.
Well, I actually thought one.
Go ahead.
So I will dive in. So I think there's a lot of talk that we kind of go through here, where it's the present versus the future, where are we now versus where are we going, and I think that it's really easy to just jump forward 50 years and say when we are building our own hearts and printing chemistry, and it's also equally easy to get stuck in today and say, well, everything is made out of this ultralight plastic that I can break in my hands. So how do you, when you're trying to work through the implications of this, balance that tension between crying wolf for the future where we can all print guns in 30 seconds in our houses, and today when we can go, okay, it's made mostly of plastic?
Yeah, I think that's the hardest part for any science and law policy area, right? So Gary Marchant, if I remember, at Arizona State, has done some really great work on nanotechnology and synthetic bio. We see this more and more, right? Where the ability for many people to get into a subject, a technology area that previously one of the reasons it worked was our law works relatively well when you can centralize it, right? Think about the morning panel, right? Biotech, you go through all this, it's big industry, the FDA is involved. The FDA is not coming into everyone's home. That's not going to happen. So the questions that you point out there have to do with unintended consequences, if you want to get into the sort of wonky terminology, right? The science technology studies people have done a pretty good job pointing out it's extremely difficult always to say, well, if I do this, I'll necessarily get that outcome. So I tend to be a thin regulation person, not necessarily from sort of markets will cure or everything or anything of that nature. It's more of you want enough here that if there's something truly nasty that's going to happen, we'll have to jump on it. But yes, sometimes you might have to wait till that emerges. Because if you want to say just be completely risk averse, you'll shut it down and you'll never get all the unintended upsides. I mean, people don't know what's going to come out of the printers. But, they experiment and go, hey, wait.
Yeah.
This was extremely difficult and a nuisance for metal. But I can do this other process and look what I got. And that's what I want to make sure stays open.
So there's an interesting thing. I'll be curious to hear if anyone along this panel actually is for closing it. But one of the things that I think, I think there are a couple of forces that will be in favor of doing that. And I'm curious to hear some of the thoughts from you guys on the law side on how we can maybe stop that. But for one, the two largest manufacturers, because they are multi-billion-dollar companies, benefit from a lot of regulation having to be done because the cost for them is fairly small, whereas the cost for us as a small 18-person startup would be huge, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a good way of kind of like stifling competition.
Right.
And the other element, of course, is companies like Mattel or other big companies. And Mattel is actually doing stuff with 3D printing, but any company that Lego is a really great example as well. I have a couple of good friends at Lego, being Scandinavian, of course. And when I first started 3D printing, I started sending them these 3D printed Lego pieces, and they were kind of wonky, and they were like, ha ha ha, Espen, that's very cute. And I've been consistently sending them 3D printed Lego pieces about once a quarter for 2 years now, and they're not laughing anymore. Because Lego is basically injection molded plastic, and I can now 3D print better Lego bricks on one of our 3D printers faster and cheaper than they can ship them to the store, and they'll still be much smoother and so on, but it doesn't matter because they're toys. And I could easily see that kind of company feeling threatened and wanting to shut down the space as well.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that came up earlier today was this idea of contributors infringement and creating safe harbor. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that as well, whether there are things that we could do proactively to kind of force the space open.
Absolutely. I mean, so a couple things there. One, I had heard that Lego was starting to become, maybe because you're sending them things, a little bit more interesting about send us your design and we'll make it for you.
So they've got an online space called Kusa,
Yeah.
and it's actually very much geared towards crowdsourcing
Right.
of design and connecting with 3D printing.
Super clever because it allows them to get people used to the idea of don't do this at home, do it with us. But we'll see. I think that there are a couple other options that will happen. One, as far as the hardware regulation, I think it's a fantastic point because for those of you really interested in this space, read the work by Neil Gershenfeld and others from MIT who were some of the pioneers of the Fab Labs. And what they did by design was make sure the hardware and software was quite open source, 100% open source, because they had experienced design software from the 80s where there's a thing that people call the dreaded dongle, where you had this really expensive design system and you put in a key, right? Early DRM.
AutoCAD had this.
Exactly, it was AutoCAD. And what happened would be, it would just decide that what you wanted to do wasn't recognized, so all your work would get locked up, right? It's an old idea, and these guys knew that and said, forget that. And so they've deployed it in inner cities of Boston, parts of Scandinavia, parts of India, Africa, and what's been interesting is each area then did whatever they felt with it. So that's the reason to not go with the lockdown and to keep the intermediary liability. I think you probably need a law to be clear to make sure that, because patents are strict liability. Those would be the quick things about what you're saying, where I think this is what motivated me to write the paper, was there are a couple spots where I think just enough of let's give a shield should allow the people to go back and forth, and there'll be market solutions, and there'll be people who sue. The other thing that's interesting and dangerous, and I have a feeling you want to talk about, is a networked printer, to me, will end up being like streaming video. So I'll never get the design on my machine. And we talk about that in the paper, and I don't like that. So I'm going to use that to try and tee you up, because I think that fits some of your outlook.
Say that again, Tom. Explain
Well,
what you're
if you
saying.
think about it, one of the things that happened, right, and no one really paid attention, were there two things, right? HDMI is a nasty, nasty standard, in my opinion, because each component will sometimes decide you haven't been up to date for authorized content reaching you. So this happens with me at home right now. When I move just with a clean, paid-for cable signal through my receiver back into my speakers, it takes a while before it catches up and decides, yes, this is authorized. Now, go further. The beauty of YouTube and Netflix is I get it wherever I want. You never have a copy of it, ever. And so it's all streamed. Now, with this sort of stuff, if you want to say, hey, I've got the file and I get to play with it, right? Mix it up, do something new. You need the file. So I have a feeling what could quickly happen is Lego says, look, the iTunes model is exactly what we want, but we don't want you to ever have it. We'll just stream it to you. You want 100 bricks? Great. Hit print. You're authorized. 100 come out. You never get to see the file. Today, people do know how to hack a stream. But I have a feeling that could happen so that, well, if most of us, again, for me, I may not care. I'm not cool enough to design, to be honest. But if I wanted to, I hate the idea. I can't do what I used to do with audio cassette, which is record part of a song, turn it into even at my amateur level, a mix, right? Or certainly with words, the ability to cut, paste, play. That's still here for us. But as we get more and more locked up, I think this is where our friends at the ACAO have something to say.
So, similarly, sort of, I think we're at a really interesting problem also with the law, where it's really hard to make coherent statements about, make really hard coherent statements in the law about this without talking about how the tech works. You can't talk about the IP of 3D printers without talking a little bit about how 3D printers work. You can't approach it purely as an IP theory problem, right? So,
no, that sounds like a challenge to law professors. I think we can.
but but we've seen this before, right? This is the same thing in privacy, right?
Sure. But I think the issue is, of course, that I think you're right. People will take the current state of technology and legislate and try to regulate that, which is its own fear. But there's also just regulating the abstract. We don't need to worry about 3D printing. We'll just regulate, design, the concept of design itself. And that's scary because then there are, the higher level you get, the more unintended consequences. The more you gear in specific technology, the more unintended consequences. You have to have something that's neither of those two, which is not easy, which is why maybe regulation of this is not the right route.
Yeah.
Although, and I'll follow up with the question, though. The one thing I'm concerned about is that I know I agree with you that regulating is maybe not the right thing, but there are people who don't think it's a red herring for various reasons, for IP reasons, for gun reasons, for everything else.
Yeah.
How do you convince them of that?
I think you go back to, this is where the law, at least currently, we try and make the case, I hope people agree, that this is in fact just part of the statutes and the case law. That's why the Betamax case is a big deal. Look, people debate it, but if the thing that can barely just copy has substantial non-infringing use, I would, if a judge actually said, I don't see how this has substantial non-infringing use for a 3D printer, which kind of doesn't do anything until you make it do work, it's so much more like a PC, then, it's that moment where you go, this is where it's good to be a young attorney, because it's your job to keep fighting that fight, and hopefully someone pays you, so you can point out to them, you got to get this right, because there's no way that's accurate. So that, to me, the guts of what I think I know about the technology, I'd be astonished if someone said it's not general purpose technology. But to your point, that hasn't stopped people in the past, and then I think that's just part of the education.
So can I just ask one last question? I know I'm supposed to go, but I'm stalling. Um, I just want to come at it from the other side. It sounds to me, I want you to answer this question if you can, without going too far away from. You go into jargon, and I lose the thread.
Fair enough.
If Espen's company decides to make Lego blocks,
Yeah.
and I'm assuming Lego has a copyright or a patent or something on its idea of Lego blocks, and they're making exact duplicates, do you think Lego should be able to enforce that right or not?
It depends to me on how his company is doing it. If he's starting to do it at scale, yeah, that's the issue.
What does that mean?
Well, that's the hard part, right? Is the exact copies makes me say, it's hard for me to say that should be okay. But on the other hand, if he's tinkering with something that's a little more complicated and there should be a chance for a fair use or something which patent doesn't have, then I want to make sure that that's possible. And so there's also just the practical realities. Like, people think that, oh, well, don't I have a right to copy at home? Well, no, you don't. It's just you kind of are able to.
So Lego is actually a really interesting example in this, because Lego's patent on their core thing, which is the brick, expired about 10 or even 15 years ago. So there are actually companies out there making fake Lego bricks. The only difference is that they don't have the Lego logo on them. And, for a lot of, and my understanding of patent and design patent law is limited, but it's my understanding that it's very, very hard actually to stop people from replicating objects. You can stop people from using your trademark, but as long as if I printed a Nike shoe, for instance, as long as I don't put any of the designed patent features that they have, so, the Swish logo and so on.
So the multi-billion-dollar Coca-Cola industry has their bottle patented.
There you go.
Yeah, there you go.
No. It's a trade dress.
But it's
Well,
a trademark.
whatever, it's protected. It's intellectual property stuff.
But to your point, and not to get into jargon, those two do matter, right? Because trade dress, to Espen's point, it's virtually eternal. As long as you use it, it's yours. But this is one of the things where 3D printing, there's some interesting assumptions again, was that not everyone could make the bottle. It used to be expensive to make things in a way that would actually harm people, right? That's what you're getting at. You and I, right, Rory, if you and I wanted to go out and make
Well, that's
a whole
my
bunch
question.
of
Is there
Coke
any validity to the intellectual protection, property protection, or is there no validity to it?
What do you mean by validity?
I don't know. Would you support it? Or would you just repeal them? Let's get rid of patent and copyright.
Well, I think it's more of, this is really the theme of the day, right? It's rethinking them, because I think the whole system, personally, my claim is, it worked really pretty well when it was business to business. But now that we can do that, so again, think about SodaStream, right? So SodaStream has these things. Now suppose, right, we were to start making bottles, Coke bottles, just because we like the bottle. There's actually studies that show, and I love Coke, but there are studies that show that it is all in my head. Literally, you could put something that's not Coke, but a cola in the can. The pleasure centers will fire in my head, and I will be happy. So it turns out the packaging matters for really weird reasons, and whether IP should protect them, well, you can read all my crazy articles on branding on that. But it becomes very difficult, because Coke will say, that's right, I meant to do that, and you got to protect that. But I don't think the law should be rushing in to protect things when they become, there is a level where when it just doesn't work, I think we're making a big mistake. As Mark put it, if you've got to take millions of people and round them up and take them to court and go after them, it should be a signal that, be a good American company or any company. Pivot, compete, use your brand, use your trademark, use the new area that's a problem, which is source of material, the design files. Go to that and use the huge amount of money you've been given under old IP protection to go forward. Because otherwise, the line at Google was one I liked, which was evolve or die. And I don't think the law should be keeping these things on life support if it turns out that that's just not going to work without heavy-handed controls.
So actually, maybe the honest question, or?
I'm gonna hold off on questions until we sort of get towards the end, so we can get through everybody.
Can I ask one more though?
Oh, of course.
So
You're special. You're on the panel.
Right. So I had a thought, which is that there's a combination that's interesting, which is we have the internet, which makes the distribution easy, and we have the printing, which makes scale easy.
Yep.
does that change the economics? Because now it's not the issue of I reproduce one song for myself. It's I can reproduce. I mean, imagine having you're talking about Coke bottles. What if I can not print, but produce Coke?
Right.
I buy one bottle from Coke.
Yeah.
I fill it up myself forever and ever with an exact duplicate of the soda. How does that play out? Does it make any sense to have the Coke bottle itself protected and the commodity that I keep consuming, the consumable, not
Right.
protected? So when
Right.
consumables are reproducible, I
Yeah.
think there's a difference there between the actual one time only. I mean, a song isn't really a consumable. You can play it multiple times, but you collect more songs.
Right.
But you might, food or other things that are protected or trademarked or whatever in some sense now, because Coke has its formula. If that's no longer protected, what happens?
Well, that's where Coke's going to be, right? So this is the scarcity point that Professor Lemley was talking about, right? It's, well, we've got our trade secret. We pretty much think no one else can make Coca-Cola, and boy, we're going to continue to believe that. Of course, SodaStream comes along, and maybe it's close enough, so you do use the old bottles, or you print your own bottle, and there you go. And the hardest question here, one of the interesting questions with trademark is, it's supposed to be about source again. So if I come to your house, and you offer me a Coke bottle, do I still think that that's actually something you bought from Coke? Or do I, in a future where most of us have this, think, oh, well, you might have bought that or printed it yourself, right? You might have bought a whole bunch you could have bought old Coke bottles anyway and refilled them, but then the law makes some very interesting assumptions about the post-sale issues with trademarks, in other words, right? So to your point, you might have sat there and filled them up with SodaStream and had a cool little bottle cap device and be like, yeah, here you go, Devin. And I might be just happy, not going, it's icy cold, it's a hot day, I feel great.
Right.
But to your point,
Coke's not happy.
Coke's going to really wonder what just happened. And so I think that's where the idea of the source materials, right? As you say, the true rivalrous goods are going to become perhaps even more important in terms of that is scarce. And so the question of, well, what's really in there? But as smart consumers, will people assume that it's actually from Coke anymore? I don't know. All right.
So I need to stand up because Mark Lemley demonstrated law professors have a hard time sitting and talking. So we're going to get that first slide up. Maybe do slideshow from the beginning.
Oh, there it is. It's up here. You're
So
set?
we're going to see how this works. It's because I took this seriously. So first of all, the title of the panel is Keeping Guns Off the Streets by Keeping Them Out of Printers. And Espen, I think, asked the question, are we going to disagree? And I think the answer is we are not. Here we are, right, in the Bay Area. It's very hard to have an anti-innovation position if you live here, because we all have profited so much from, not just economically, but just our lifestyles. So I think the title's a little bit misleading. I have a different title, Guns Don't Kill People, 3D Printing Does, question mark. Why the concern is a distraction from effective gun control. Devin used the word red herring. I'm going to say it's not a complete red herring, but it's a distraction. Let's see if I can make this thing work to the next slide. There you go. So how do you describe the United States relationship with guns? And I'm a criminal law professor and a constitutional law professor. I'm really glad that the ACLU is here because the Second Amendment, of course, is one of your civil liberties. And I imagine he'll be defending it. Love-hate relationship, right? We have, and I'm reading a little bit, Americans have long depended on firearms for securing food and safety and their liberty. The Second Amendment confers a right to keep and bear arms, and the Supreme Court has held that right is fundamental and individual. Dirty Harry with his handgun. Who's old enough to remember Dirty Harry, right? Do you feel lucky? He's our hero. And so the fact is, I think large segments of this country are in love with guns. At the same time, large segments of the American people hate guns. Handgun violence is pervasive. It's been described as an epidemic. Schoolroom gun massacres are repeatedly horrifying to us. Americans don't any longer need guns to survive, for the most part. They fear their misuse, and they would like to see guns restricted to, at the most, select responsible owners. So Americans hate guns. So what do we do with this love-hate relationship? The 20th century saw an effort to regulate guns. There weren't really firearm regulations. Justice Breyer, in his dissent in the Heller case, has some good statistics and some good history in the McDonald case as well about, revolutionary time restrictions on guns. But as the majority in those opinions points out, they were really restrictions on gunpowder because they were a fire hazard. And so there wasn't much regulation. And meanwhile, right, the revolutionary, Washington, our first president, they were all using guns. Guns were necessary to take the frontier because the Native Americans were all slaughtered by guns, as well as disease. And food was on the hoof, right? You had to use your gun. So guns were sort of pervasive in American society and in the consciousness of the American people. But then the 20th century saw another threatening technology called the automobile. You guys have thought about what automobile means, right? Self-moving. This was terrifying technology. I have a quote, it'll take me too long to get it out, from the New York Times in 1897, which says, "This new and terrible word, automobile, describes a moving cart or wagon." That was not that long ago. Automobiles came into play in the 20th century, and all of a sudden, people with guns could move around really fast and get away, and we began to see serious gun regulation. And at the same time, you saw a sort of pro-gun lobby, and you saw a Second Amendment resurgence, right? So gun control in the United States is a misnomer. There is not gun control in this country. It's a very inconsistent and incomplete set of regulations, none of which go far enough to satisfy people who really hate guns, and many of which go farther than the people who love guns would like. And so it's a political balance rather than sort of an efficient system of control. It's a misnomer. Federal law has lots of gaps. You can go to gun shows and exchange guns, and they're untraceable, and you can buy and sell them without a license. There's a lot of gaps in federal law, and the state's laws are wildly divergent. All right. Supreme Court has recognized this right in the Heller case and the McDonald case. And since Heller, 4 years ago, lower courts have struggled in trying to figure out what are the contours of the right, to keep and bear arms. I can't remember the figures, but there are something like 200 or 300 lawsuits around the country challenging various gun regulations. So 2 cases, one from the Seventh Circuit in 2011, Ezel versus Chicago. These go further than Heller and McDonald, struck down a ban on shooting ranges because if you're going to have guns in the home for self-defense, you have to be able to train on how to use your gun. So shooting ranges were protected, and transporting your gun back and forth from your home to your training range and back. So the Chicago regulation in that case was struck down by the Seventh Circuit. And then you all must have heard of this just a week or two ago from the Ninth Circuit, 2-1 decision which invalidates, a broad reading of this decision invalidates the entire state system in California of regulating concealed carry for firearms. That is, do you have a right to carry a firearm in public? This panel says you do, and so they strike down the restrictions on concealed carry, saying that you got to be able to either carry it concealed or not concealed, and they strike down the whole thing. Now, this is not final yet. There's certainly be an en banc petition, but you may see this case headed for the Supreme Court. All right, so now I'm going to show you the videos. Here's what I don't know how to do. Let me see if I can do this. You got to bring this arrow down here. Here's supposedly a 3D printed gun firing. I hope you can hear it. No, didn't work. This is supposed to. No, never mind. Welcome to why technology isn't as perfect as we hope it will be. Let me go on and we'll see if we can get these videos to work. Are you going to try it now? Just click on that. So, well, this is not a YouTube page. This is embedded in the, let's see if this will work. Maybe. I'm really disappointed. It works fine on my computer upstairs. if anybody wants to come up. Will that do it? All right.
Yeah, just go to the original.
Okay, now we need some things. Well, you can see it. This is a gun that was made on a metal printer. And he's firing it at
Some people don't like this science. They foresee criminals making copies of untraceable weapons. Some people don't like this trend. They foresee criminals making copies of untraceable weapons. But the company says most people will not be able to afford the equipment.
I'm going to show you how they assembled it. So that's supposedly a 3D printed gun on a metal printer. And that assembly at the end, they made 7 components and put it together in 7 minutes, they said, and it fired. So this is a shotgun shell that was printed, if we can get this to play. How did go to the next, this may not have the source.
You've heard of a 3D printed gun? Yeah. It's this little single shot thing, and it's like, oh, how about 3D printed bullets? We got Tony made me a couple 3D printed shotgun slugs. This is 4/10 of an ounce. He specified that we put some lead shot in it because it weighed nothing. It weighed like 1/10 of an ounce, if that. So this was actually printed on a 3D printer.
Lead that's inside.
Probably took an hour to print this little slug, big slug actually.
This is going to go too
We're gonna
long.
see how it works.
The next one, if you go to the next video, it'll show you, they'll fire it, I think. It may not play though.
Using a Mossberg 590 there, and we'll see what 3D. I don't think anyone's ever made a 3D bullet or slug or whatever, even though it's using a standard shotgun shell, but it's still a bullet made on a 3D printer. We got a couple of them. Let's see if they'll even load. Oh, perfect. We're ready.
That's a commercial.
Okay, anytime you're ready. Wow. Wow, that actually worked really good. It looked like it went through straight. It's hard to say. Let's flip her over. Almost looked like it went straight through there. Here's a piece of it. Actually, oh wow. There's a piece of it. It's almost, look at that. I didn't realize it was like a honeycomb inside. Bullet pierced that. And out that side. And so, I don't think we'll be able to find out what happens when we.
Don't go to the next slide yet. So, right now the technology is not great, but it's improving all the time. And what I'm told is that it's going to get cheaper, it's going to get better. You're going to be able to print from any material you want, and you're going to be able to print bullets. And then some people tell me you're going to be able to print the gunpowder, or whatever the components are you need to have gunpowder, and you'll just add salt and pepper. So I think it's useful for this debate to think about what 3D printing is going to be like in the future. And I have a clip from the future to show you what 3D printing will be like. So you can, hopefully this will play.
Darren, don't you think you ought to put on a coat? You're not wearing one.
So Elizabeth Montgomery just 3D printed a jacket. It's a nanotechnology. She has it imprinted in her lips, and she just wiggles her lips and bang. That's the way it works. All right. So that's on my tell and show. So I think when you think about this, you have to imagine a world where it will be that easy. And the question is, what do you do about people printing guns? Operational, functional guns. So there are two issues when you say, let's talk about 3D printed guns. And they're conceptually separate. I think you need to keep them separate. One is the technology and the uses of 3D printing. And the other is gun regulation. And it's important to separate the two because they are not coextensive, right? When automobiles were invented, there were a lot of states that enacted robbery by car statutes because they needed a new statute to address this technology. And then people figured out, and this is what is automobile, where's that actually come from? When electricity began to span the United States, the federal government in 1934 or so enacted a wire fraud statute, right? Because wires were suddenly threatening technology. But the problem was robbery, not cars, and the problem is fraud, not wires. And we didn't ban cars, and we didn't ban wires, and we regulated them without inhibiting their development, and that's sort of my theme. The problem is guns, not 3D printing. Now, that doesn't mean 3D printing isn't relevant to the gun control, but it's a distraction. Apologies to Professor Desai, who calls it a red herring. If the problems and dangers of misuses of guns, if that's the problem, then the focus should be on guns, whatever the means of production may be, or the means of distribution may be. It's important to remember, so my tagline here, not on restricting or inhibiting the technology. It's important to remember, prisoners in prisons today, they make guns. They make zip guns out of whatever materials they have, and they're deadly when they use them. Why don't organized crime gangs, why doesn't the whatever cartel, why don't they just make their own guns? Well, because right now you can buy a gun pretty cheap on the street. Gun control doesn't keep that supply down very well, and they're safer. It's more reliable to use a gun that you purchase from a manufacturer that you recognize that has some record of safety than it is to make your own gun that blows up in your hand. All right. What I want to talk about is how would you regulate guns? And this is sort of a thought experiment. Imagining you can create a gun instantaneously. What can you imagine? The Second Amendment is a possible constraint on guns. And also the politics of getting gun regulations enacted is a constraint. And I'm not talking about either of those right now. So whether you think this could be possible or lawful is a different question than what can you imagine. So the first one, how about just banning manufacture of guns other than a licensed factory? Now we have Peter, I'm going to mess up your name, Jensen Hexel, who is a graduate of Golden Gate Law School and wrote an article last year about guns and 3D printing. I think it's the best one out there, if it's not the only one. And he argues that there is a Second Amendment right to make a gun at home. If there's a Second Amendment right to use a gun and have a gun at home, you should have the right to make it. And that may be true. I'm not arguing one way or the other. But if you limit the manufacture of guns to licensed factories, you would have to make one at home, you would have to get a license. You'd have to allow inspection. You'd have to meet certain regimentary requirements, whatever. How about banning possession of any gun that's 3D printed? We just say 3D printed guns are too dangerous. We're going to ban them like we ban automatic machine guns. You can imagine a ban like that. Whether the Second Amendment would permit it, I don't know. How about unlawful to transmit or distribute a usable plan to print a gun? Chris will talk about why that's unconstitutional. But there are cases about people distributing plans to build bombs. And for the most part, courts have said it is an unconstitutional restriction on the First Amendment to ban simply the distribution of ideas, even if they are dangerous plans. It's sort of the same argument we had in the early 20th century about distributing, Karl Marx's literature because it was so dangerous. And we ended up saying, well, no, the First Amendment protects that. All right, are there less restrictive controls you can imagine? How about all home manufacturers must imprint a serial number on a gun, and that serial number has to be registered with the government? How about any plan to print the gun has to be registered with the PWAB, or a duplicate of the transmission of that plan must be sent to the PWAB. You're familiar with the PWAB, right? It's the Printable Weapons and Ammunition Board. We don't need another acronym agency, I say, but we could still use the ATF, right? But how about you got to register the plans? Even more imaginable, and now you can play the same game, right? You can start to imagine things. How about all guns have to be registered with titles? And any sale or distribution of a homemade gun, at least, or maybe all guns, must be registered, just like the transfer of a vehicle. In fact, you can ask very quickly, why aren't guns regulated at least as extensively as cars are and drivers? right? We have far more regulations on cars and drivers than we have on guns and gun users in this country. That's a political balance that has been struck. That's incomplete. That's not control. How about regulating ammunition? You can imagine lots of, okay, you can print all the guns you want, but you can't get the ammunition. You can hit a burglar over the head with it. My guess is ammunition is constitutionally protected if guns are constitutionally protected. You have to have whatever makes a gun usable for self-defense if there's a right to possess a gun for self-defense. And then how about regulating gunpowder like a controlled substance? You know how drugs are regulated, right? It's a controlled substance. You can only buy it with a prescription. You can't buy certain controlled substances that are really dangerous. Maybe gunpowder will be, but it's not now. It's not regulated today. So would this prevent secret 3D gun factories? This is the real problem, right? And you all already adverted to this. You can imagine the gun gang saying, we don't care about your stinking laws. And they just go and make a secret gun factory. There probably are already secret gun factories in various places in this country. The answer is no. You can't prevent it. Right? Walter White and his companion bought an RV and started manufacturing meth in the desert. And if you don't catch this reference, you caught this reference, right? Yeah, even from Norway. So newsflash, right? Violent criminal gangs won't follow the law. Point being that you can't hope to regulate the illegal use or distribution or manufacture of guns by passing laws so that law-abiding people are restricted, let's say, from innovation or whatever, because the people who don't care about the laws aren't going to follow whatever you put in place. You have to do other things. It hasn't led this newsflash hasn't led America to ban or inhibit technology in the past. How many of you have a 2D printer at home? Right? Most people have. It's called a photocopier, and I can use it to photocopy counterfeit bills, child pornography, or seditious literature. Now, none of those things are legal, but if I have them, I can copy them. I can make them at home. I can distribute them. It's all not legal, but if I want to violate the law, I can. But nobody regulates my photocopier, which I can buy at Staples for a pretty cheap price. So here's my conclusion. 3D printers don't kill people. Guns do. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Rory.
Sure.
So I think there's a couple interesting points that I'll tie together that you made. First is that, yes, it is absolutely true that a criminal in the United States who really wants to get a gun doesn't seem to have much trouble in getting one. But I think where 3D guns
I think you buy it right out on the street here in the Tenderloin for about $50.
Yeah. But I think the reason 3D printing might change that just a little, if you accept the argument, is that it does change the fundamental economics of it. Maybe more of the people you don't want to have guns will have guns than would otherwise. I'm not sure if this is true. I'm just trying to spin out the argument that how might 3D printing take us from where we are now to where we're going.
Right. If that's the question, right? If you're Elizabeth Montgomery and you can twitch your lips and have a gun, then it changes it. If it costs more than $50 to get the machine and the materials, plus your time and effort, to print a gun, and the gun is not as reliable as the $50 gun on the street, then maybe your bigger problem is, I'm not suggesting you not regulate 3D printing of guns. I'm suggesting you regulate it in a way that addresses the underlying concerns and doesn't inhibit the technology, because the innovation side of technology, I think, is very valuable, and I think that's the history of technology in this country. If we're concerned about liberty for the Second Amendment, we're also concerned about it generally, would be my response. But it could change the economics.
But again, not much, not quickly. I mean, the 3D printed shotgun shell, they printed the least interesting part of the shotgun, right? It was the plastic casing that goes around the bullet. You still need the slug, you still need the black powder, you still need the actual shotgun to fire it.
Right.
So let's take a step back from that then. How do you quell that panic in some sense? Because clearly you think about a local news piece on this, right? What is local news piece going to say? Anyone can print a bullet in their garage. And the technical reality is much different. So maybe the job of the lawyer in this case is to go in front of a court, So, okay, imagine you're a prosecutor, right, or a defense attorney, and you're trying or defending the first case in which someone was killed with a 3D printed gun.
Right.
How would your arguments be different, or would they?
Well, interesting question, because people are killed with guns all the time. And there have been lawsuits. I can't remember the details of this. There's like an immunity out there for firearms manufacturers. You can't sue them because somebody used their gun to shoot somebody.
Is he a firearms manufacturer?
Well, I think you end up.
Is he immune?
I think you end up being a firearms manufacturer if you are manufacturing guns. So, in other words, one of my points would be you would regulate the definition to include production of firearms at home, if you could politically get it enacted. So I mean, I think you have to address the realities of what's there. What was the other half of the question?
The other half of the question was, okay, so say let's take you're a defense attorney, okay,
Yeah.
and you're in a criminal trial, and your client is on trial criminally for having killed someone with a gun that they printed at home.
Right.
Would your arguments be different than if they used a gun that they bought off
You know,
the street corner?
it's hard to imagine, but I would imagine a regime that says when you print a gun at home, you have to put a serial number on it. I would imagine a regime that says when you transfer a gun, made at home or otherwise, you have to keep track of that transfer, either by title or registration or something. That's not the regime we have now. If you have that regime, then if I'm a prosecutor, I'm going to go after people who are contributing to the violation of that regime. So if there's somebody printing guns at home, or if Espen is printing guns and not putting the serial number on, and not keeping track of the paperwork the right way, that's who I go after. That's who the feds go after today. That's who the ATF goes after today, is people who trade in illegal firearms if they can trace them. And by the way, you have a penalty, right? Anybody who does a drug crime with a gun gets an extra 5 years in jail. Now, I don't know whether I'm in favor of that, the harshness of that penalty or prison in general, but you can add penalties, right, by legislation. So you could say, well, if you kill somebody with a homemade gun, you get an extra 3 years. I don't know why a homemade gun is any different than any other kind of gun, I guess.
The only thing I would say in the context is that you'd have a very hard time arguing that it was a split-second decision, because you'd have to wait like 9 hours for the gun to print out.
Well, this is where the
So-
technology actually is
Yeah.
important. You can't. We're not at the bewitched version of 3D printing, and we're not going to be there for, I don't know, how long do you think it would be until we get there?
That's always really hard to say.
I mean,
can
but
tell you
it's decades, right? Like we're
What's
not.
that rule
wouldn't
about
say
every
snapping
7
fingers
years it
version.
gets 700 times better?
Snapping the fingers isn't going to happen, but the future is closer than you think in terms of being able to easily enable having easy access to custom metal parts. That's just around the corner. Yeah, but it's not going to be your desktop 3D printer is going to be the Kinko's corner store, right? So you walk down there with a design and they can make it for you. And at that point, whether they are a gun manufacturer or not is going to be a really interesting example. And I can tell you that already most of the online services are choosing not to deliver on 3D printed gun parts. Although people are doing it at home as well. I've got one of our customers, whose name shall remain anonymous, has created and he's doing parts of the gun, not the whole gun, but he's got an AR-15 assault rifle that is modified for his daughter as a Hello Kitty assault rifle, and it's terrifying. It is truly terrifying and very, very pink. So, people are doing that kind of stuff already. Yeah. But to get it back to, the legal side, I think, the technological limitations are perhaps more interesting in a court of law than the future stuff just yet. But I do think, and I totally buy your argument, Rory, that these are two very separate issues. There's the technology, and then there's gun control. And I would be very, very sad. And we had this hype cycle thing, if you look at the Forbes hype cycle, you kind of get to this peak point where 3D printing guns was part of the discussion, and to some extent very much still is. But a couple of months ago, every journalist that came by our office was asking us about 3D printed guns. And it saddens me because right now, like next week, we've got a father here in the Bay Area whose son has muscular dystrophy, and his son is now unable to lift his hands up to this level, and he plays the flute. And he loves playing the flute. It's one of his few pleasures. And there's a mouthpiece that you can get that enables you to play the flute like this instead of like this. But that mouthpiece is $1,500 at the moment. And he's bringing in the flute, and we're going to scan the flute, and we're going to custom make him a mouthpiece. And we can do that for $12, you know. And that's the conversation I'd like to have about 3D printing. It's about empowering and enabling people to do things that, you know, earlier were impossible, that are now possible. I don't want 3D printers as a tool to be associated with 3D printing guns. And I was very nervous about coming here today for that exact reason.
Are you still nervous?
Well, I mean, I can see that you guys here on the panel are you know, of a similar opinion, but I'm here because I think that it's an important dialogue that we need to engage in because we take safety very seriously. But we're also pushing very hard, and we've been talking to, you know, legislators, and there's a, you know, the Electronic Frontiers Foundation. We've got Jackie Spears, of course, we've spoken to, and other members of Congress as well, to ensure that there's some education and understanding about what 3D printing does and doesn't do as well, because it is such an important issue. And I genuinely believe that more lives would be lost or ruined from the absence of 3D printing, or from too much control of 3D printing, than, you know, the other argument makes.
You know, Brian, to answer one of your questions, what can you do to sort of avoid the hysteria of it? I want to give a little shout out to the Hastings Law Journal, and I think most of the people in the room are now associated with the Hastings Law Journal because they have to be here, but it's a nice day outside on a Friday afternoon. But, you know, the Hastings Law Journal putting on a symposium like this and spreading information that are, you know, that's correct, and talking about things like this flute mouthpiece is a valuable service, and to the extent there aren't any reporters here, that's too bad, but that's what the media, they could come and watch something like this. I think this is a valuable contribution to the other side of that debate.
Okay. Chris, you are the last to do your spiel, and then we will continue the conversation.
Great. Is there a clicker there or something?
Yeah, it's right over here.
Do you want me to slide over so you can see what you're doing? Or?
No, I think I can. I'm coming up, so I will make do. If I can get it started. There we go. So I get to go last, which is always challenging because it means that the good side is I get to respond to what people have said. The bad side is they've said pretty much everything I want to say, so I have to go off a little bit. But I want to kind of tie in what Rory and what Devin said and how my view contrasts. You know, Rory basically said that 3D printing is not a threat to gun control is distinct from the 3D printing, and you should focus on gun control. My concern is actually the opposite, that guns are a threat to 3D printing. Not 3D printed guns are a threat to society, because bringing things together, bringing guns into the conversation, along with IP, along with competitive pressures, along with all these other things, is going to give people an incentive or an excuse, as the case may be, to try to do something about this, to try to act in a way that could be very harmful in a lot of different ways. And so my job is not so much to say why you shouldn't. My job is to say why you can't, why the Constitution actually is going to push back against any efforts to regulate. But first I'm going to explain why, and I give you 4 words that will explain why people want to regulate 3D related to guns. Think of the children. These are mine. I'm worried about their safety. I'm worried about dangerous things. My 2.5-year-old likes to play with anything and loves the kitchen especially, the stove, the knives, everything like that. My 6-month-old likes to put everything he can get his hands on in his mouth. So I'm thinking about their safety. I'm concerned about their safety, and there are plenty of people and plenty of regulators and legislators who want to protect the children. And that is a mantra that has a lot of gravitas, a lot of political capital. So when we are saying it's okay, I'm not worried about this because we can explain it away, it gets dangerous when you bring things like guns or dangerous objects into the world. And we have, I mean, guns are one we talked about shanks. The first panel talked about biological organisms. Viruses are pretty darn dangerous. There are other things you can think of. I mean, we had Breaking Bad on the screen a minute ago. You can think of 3D printing and the similar technologies manufacturing illegal drugs, which are also very dangerous. So when you have these dangerous things and you can tie them to a technology, there's a tendency not just to regulate the activities, but to think about ways to regulate the technology itself. And this goes back to Napster. This goes back to Betamax. This goes back to the printing press. This goes back to Prometheus. So Prometheus, of course, is the bringer of fire. He stole fire from the gods and gave it to the people. This was first example of a couple of things. First example, mythology, whatever. One being he took something that was a limited resource, fire controlled by the gods, and gave it to people where it could be instantly, freely copied. They could share it. They could, in theory, recreate it. It was contained in the wood that they could use. Almost every mythology has some kind of story of a trickster stealing fire. The other thing that Prometheus in particular is a story of is the powers that be punishing this. So Prometheus, for stealing fire and giving it to people, was chained to a rock and his liver was eaten. I knew that part. What I didn't realize before I started looking at this is that Pandora's box was a consequence of Prometheus. So when you're talking about the music industry going after its users, this is where that started. So we have technology that was given to people, and it was a powerful thing, it was a dangerous thing, and government reacted. And we have seen that. That still happens. I'll talk in a minute about cyberbullying. But cyberbullying is essentially, in many cases, saying mean things about people on the internet. We don't regulate saying mean things about people. We don't regulate the internet, but when you put them together, somehow people really get up in arms and want to do something about it. And that scares me. So my job, again, is to figure out what we can do about it. And, oh, that's the wrong slide. I'll start there anyhow. So, for those of you who were at the Symposium here last year, this is Laurie Drew. Laurie Drew is a good example of what happens when the government tries to regulate in the technology space and does so poorly. Anyone not familiar with the story of Laurie Drew? All right, brief summary. Laurie Drew was a mother with a teenage daughter who decided to get on Facebook, make a fake profile, and basically torment another teenage girl. The other girl wound up committing suicide. Very, very sad story. And Laurie Drew is not a wonderful human being. But what happened is that the assistant DA, or the U.S. attorney, decided that he couldn't figure out how to prosecute her for this, so he prosecuted her for unauthorized access to a computer system because she lied about her profile on Facebook. How many people here have never lied about an online profile or form? Anyone? All right. You are not a criminal. According to that, everyone else in this room has committed a criminal act if you buy into that theory. Now, you might not be prosecuted, but the danger here is pretty obvious, that if everything is criminal, if a broad class of things that you do with technology can be made criminal because you're worried about some narrow harm cases, that's not a good situation. That empowers abuse, that empowers discrimination, that creates a whole lot of harms that we would like to see avoided. And we can imagine the same kind of thing with a very general purpose technology like 3D printing if you try to focus on how do we stop 3D printed guns. So you move on to, well, what can we do about that? And my job as a constitutional lawyer is to think about the Constitution. And to be honest, the Second Amendment is not my specialty, which is why I'm glad Rory covered it pretty well. But you can think about the ways the Second Amendment would protect and limit applications of regulation to 3D printed guns. But to me, what's interesting is that you can't think about the Second Amendment alone. You have to think about a lot of other things, because there is an interplay between the Second Amendment and other constitutional rights when you get to the area of technology, and especially of 3D printed guns. Because all of these different pieces are going to provide regulation and not only limits in the legal sense, but explain why it is so dangerous and so scary to try to regulate 3D printing in order to get at 3D printed guns and weapons and dangerous things. So I'll start with the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment is, of course, about self-incrimination is what most people think of, but it also provides due process. And the 14th Amendment applies that to the states. The Laurie Drew case is a very good example of an instance where people need to know what they're doing is not allowed. And when you're talking about components, when you're talking about 3D printing that is mostly building pieces, it's hard to imagine regulation that can very clearly define what is and is not part of a gun, unless it's putting it all together. But then you're not really talking about the 3D printing, you're talking about assembling a gun. But if you're focused on the 3D printing aspects of things, of a general purpose technology and trying to limit, criminalize, penalize uses of that, you can run into constitutional danger areas very, very quickly. I'm going to go through these very quickly because I know there's a lot of questions and I want to get to them. Fourth Amendment is another area that I think really ties into this. And this is going to a lot of Rory's points. The issue of privacy relates very closely to, well, what if you regulate 3D printing of guns not by prohibiting it, not by limiting, not by having some vague criminal prohibition, but by requiring, for example, tracking of what happens on a 3D printer. Limit tracking exactly what files are downloaded, so you know whether someone downloaded a file, or perhaps identifying what's printed on a 3D printer. If you take a really, really, really close look at your program, you might find a series of dots that look like this. So most 2D color printers today have essentially watermarking. This is invisible to the naked eye. You can see it with a microscope, even with a really strong magnifying glass. But it is essentially an encoding of what printer printed this at what time. It is a tracking method, so that if you find something that is illegal, dangerous, more likely it's copyright or some kind of IP violation, you can trace it to its source. It is very easy in one sense to think about pushing this into the 3D printing world. We want to make sure that if we want to regulate 3D guns, we don't need to print a serial number on them. We'll just make every 3D printer embed a serial number in everything it prints. Oh wait, and then if we want to figure out who printed it, we have to figure out who owns the printer. And then you start having red flags, because now it's not, you're not regulating 3D printing of guns, you're regulating 3D printing. You're taking an entire class of positive, socially beneficial behavior and making it seem like it's criminal, making it seem like it's limited, restricting it, putting this information in the hands of the government, and as we know from Edward Snowden and many others, that's not necessarily the safest place for big lists of people's personal information to reside. You can also think of, I also learned just earlier from Epson that it might not necessarily work. If you, for example, embedded something very carefully in the plastic that the 3D printer prints, and then it's all melted because you're making a mold to inject a metal part, that might be gone. You could try to require it to be a surface feature, but now you're getting into the First Amendment. Because if you are creating 3D printers, you want to be able to do what you want to be able to do. Whether you're a printer, whether you're a designer of a file, you have a right to express yourself. And that might not include having a particular etching on your product, on your design, having your printer do everything that it wants to. It might not include being limited in what you can get. You talk about the iTunes model of here's the set of files you can download and print, and even printers that are networked so that you don't control the files, they just tell you what's available, pick from your list, and that's it. That's a real threat, and that's a real constitutional issue under the First Amendment. There are also other First Amendment issues. If you try to prohibit distribution of gun files, there have been some narrow cases that have said you can limit distribution of weapons and weapon design materials internationally for national security reasons, but that's exclusively been limited to the international context. And the idea that a file that has gun design in it, not a weapon of mass destruction, not a military grade thing, maybe an AK-47, but again, it's not intended for international, it's just for local use, would have very serious First Amendment issues as well as Second Amendment issues. So these tie together very closely. And again, the First Amendment issue is going to come down to the designer too. If you can see this very carefully, there's actually an interesting pattern on the surface. You could imagine requiring printer designers to actually put a distinguishing pattern on the surface that might even carry over into a molding. But that's not what designers want to do, and that really takes away, among other things, from the open source nature of this. When you have an open source printer, then someone can take that out. And if someone can take that out, and someone wants to print a gun and they don't want it to be traced, then your entire regime is essentially going to boil down to tracking the people who want to comply with the law. And that has so many harms and so little positive things that it's very dangerous. Which brings us back to maybe we should, and this is why I think you have to focus on gun control and not on control of 3D printed guns. And maybe one of the ways of looking at it is gunpowder. Maybe one of the things like that. There are Second Amendment issues with that. There are challenges there, but they don't have the multi-pronged challenges of anything that focuses on 3D printing itself as a harm, because you're really not getting at, you really can focus on what is allowed under the Second Amendment, and Second Amendment does allow for some regulation of guns. Not broad, not, and it's being debated, and it may well change. But I've yet to see, there have been very few cases that have really addressed Second Amendment issues as they overlap with other things, but many of them find that you can't do a lot. You can require gun registration, but there are very narrow limits on what you can do with that, and nothing that says you can require registration of anything that might turn into a gun or a weapon or print out something that could be dangerous. So I think we're really in a place where even if regulators wanted to do something like this, we have very strong arguments as to why they can't, and the same arguments as to why they shouldn't. And the real reason why they shouldn't, of course, is because 3D printing is really cool. I want to go back to Pandora because another thing I learned in my brief research for this, there are two interpretations of Pandora's box. One is that, of course, she let everything out of the box except for one last thing, and she opened it up, and that was hope. And hope came out of the box, and that's how humanity survived all the hardship because we thought we could get through it. There's another version, which is that Pandora closed the box, and the last thing in there was foresight. And she kept it closed. And humanity survived because it didn't know what was coming, and therefore it wasn't afraid of it, and it kept going. I'm kind of hoping it's the former because we need foresight now. We need to not be thinking just about technology of today and these narrow concerns about guns and think of the children, oh my God, there was an accident and someone shot someone with 3D guns, and what can we do to stop that from ever happening again? We need to think about what 3D printing can mean for society, how we can help it to be beneficial, how maybe we can narrowly use it and make voluntary or better ways of controlling guns, controlling munitions, whatever, that comply with the Constitution and that limit harmful effects, but that don't clamp down on something that is really cool. I mean, look at all this stuff that's printed. We want that to grow. We want that to flourish. We don't want it to be constrained by regulation. We don't want regulation that can be abused for non-competitive purposes because you think of the children. And so I really hope that we have the foresight to make that happen. That's it.
Okay. I think you should open up to the floor, Brian. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't have too much time left.
Yeah, actually, we're exactly where I was hoping would be time-wise. So, yeah. Any questions? I know you've been waiting. So.
Yeah, well, thanks for the talk, very interesting. As Espen knows, I run a company called Automatize, and we do exactly what you talked about, Professor Dassay, we screen design for 3D printing. We sell that as a product to marketplace. Now, here's my thing. The reason I set up that company is because I noticed that 80% of the top designers we talked to wouldn't release their designs for home 3D printing because they were afraid of losing those designs to the ether. And people who own printers will never have access to those designs unless you reassure those design holders that their designs are protected in some way. So what alternatives do we have to enforcing that control? Well, in streaming or by even heavy-handed DRM, in a way that reassures the rights holder but keeps the technology open. What are our alternatives? And this ties both the need to continue the innovation with the need to protect them in some way. It completely ignores the gun issue, so I'm apologies for that.
No, I think to be clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with what your model is. I think that that's just things that will happen in the marketplace. What I don't like is when the hardware and the other things become so dumb as machines that the 10, 20%, whatever group out there that does want to in other words, if I can no longer buy a 3D printer where I can put in my own design files and do things with it and can play with it so that it becomes really a lockdown only streaming world, then I don't like it. I don't know that the law has any way to stop that coming because of kind of the dynamic you described. The only thing I have hope for is the fact that right now the open source back and community of 3D printing at all levels is still strong enough, right? That we've seen some of the hardware big players, as you pointed out, right? They have a certain advantage right now, and they're starting to assert patents, and they're starting to be okay with sort of odd regulation because they can comply better than the small companies. So those are the moments when I get worried.
To just quickly follow up.
Yeah.
I think that additionally to the strength of the open source movement, which really made 3D printing into what it is today, we also have the learning from the music industry, where really value was started to be created as music companies realized they shouldn't be so heavy-handed.
Yeah.
Right, and then I think I work very closely with all the major 3D printing manufacturers, and they tell me at least, and to my that they've learned that lesson, and they're willing not to create walled gardens and instead embrace a sort of partially screened.
Yeah. And so to your point, right, if there's a marketplace where I might go and spend something where I'm willing to get a high quality stream, but at the same time I can go elsewhere and get a file I can download directly, or go to someone else's company and commission and say, hey, do the scan and do the thing, and then we figure out who owns what, or just throw it out there for everyone. That, to me, I'm relatively okay with that. But it's more of if we ended up, for reasons that, again, the law may not be able to manage, in a much more lockdown world, or it was demanded, then I think there's a problem.
And I would say so too. And my concern is similar, but the issue is that if there's a lockdown world, then someone is curating what I can do.
Yeah.
Someone is curating what I can see. Someone is curating what, if I'm a designer, who I can get to. And that, to me, is a concern. And it's one of my biggest concern with walled garden designs, is that it really winds up that someone is really picking and choosing what speech gets to an audience and what speech doesn't. And there is an argument, which I didn't even bother with, about whether or not 3D printing files are speech or not. I think they are, but there's an argument there. But the concept of you're distributing something that could be a gun, it could be a model flower, it could be a sex toy, it could be all sorts of interesting things. And someone who is both, well, there's a privacy aspect there too, actually. So there's both someone is controlling what I get and tracking what I get. Both of those concern me to some extent. And when you have when you have an open source, an open platform, and as long as there's a choice between the two and it's not weighted towards one, I don't think there's much of a concern. But I can certainly see curated or tracked use of technology as presenting its own challenges.
Yeah, because I think you really hit the nail there as well, which is, and by the way, Authenta is a great product, just so everyone knows. But the thing is, it's about that choice, right? Because there's certain, and I actually don't think that there's going to be like one iTunes store where you go and get every single 3D print in the world. They're going to be stores for different types of things. So if you need car parts, you go in one store. If you need sports accessories, you go on another. And they might want to control it so that random dildos don't pop up on your web pages. There's a great XKCD cartoon with like the future spam is of course penises coming out at home. So, but like that's big business as well. But that's a different web page, right? And so I think as long as there's choice, it's good. But the moment that we as manufacturers have to put that kind of control in, something gets lost, because there's a massive community of makers and inventors and hobbyists out there that like designing things and want to have the freedom to continue doing that.
Or even simpler, I think your example again of that one moment where now I can go and at a reasonable cost get something that's customized, right? That fits me for what I'm doing a little better. It might be a shoe, it might be something for my kid, right? So let's think about the kids and all the things that go with kids, right? Is the other way to think about that. Braces, all the medical prosthetics that could become a bit better for kids.
How many people here lost a retainer at some point in their
Oh, there you go.
There you go.
Yeah.
We have another question over there.
Oh.
It seems like from the music industry, the solution to preserve all your freedoms and at the same time respect the rights of the copyright holder is to adopt a DRM system where if the file comes in without DRM, they're printed, so open source files can still print. And if it does have DRM, like the iTunes store used to be, your device, MAC number or serial number, had to be registered with the file provider that put in the DRM so that it would play on that one device. So that way you would, in this case the printer, so that way you would protect the right holders for copyrighted materials that want to be protected, and you'll still leave the system relatively free for the open source file.
Yeah, so I'm, as a manufacturer, I'm okay with someone else using their software on my machine, but I want to put controls into the actual machine because that makes our life a lot more complicated and also blocks out. And I'll tell you exactly why. If you look at our machine, it's modular design. It's actually been designed with hackers in mind and with future upgrades in mind. And so our machine is designed so that you can actually open up the electronics casing. We had to rewrite our warranty from scratch because there wasn't a warranty out there that actually let people open up the machine and play with it without losing the warranty, right? So we had to rewrite that. You can go into our machine and you can take out the electronic parts and put in your own. And so there's no real way for me as a manufacturer using that, what we call accessible source design approach, which is a combination of open and closed source. We do patent some of our parts as well. We have to for defensive measures, but we want our users to be able to access and hack and so on. And with that approach, it's very, very hard for me, unless I actually just encase the whole printer in essentially unopenable design for me to put any sort of control measures in place. So it has to be on the software side, and I don't think at that point it should be universal. I think it has to be through whatever service you're providing. So if you want your kids to be in school and using a particular library, and I can totally understand the need for some sort of protection.
Does your open design also negate the possibility of a USB dongle or something like that?
Oh no, you can use USB
I mean,
on
if
ours.
somebody swapped out the parts, would the USB dongle still be needed for the encrypted file?
You can rewrite the OS.
Or I mean, you can do pretty much anything with our printer. Like
Yeah.
there's from a secure point of view.
Right, but I mean you can't. There are a lot of. I mean, you can't. As far as I know, you still can't really play DVDs on Linux because you could rewrite the. You can't lock down the driver as well as you can on commercially closed source operating systems. And I could see the same thing happening here, where you have a bifurcation between the open source printers that won't be allowed to use these DRM files at all. Because there's no effective way of keeping them from circumventing the DRM, and sealed boxes. And then you get to the point where, okay, well then the DRM files wind up on BitTorrent.
But I think you're going to see a mix though. I think you're going to see, like, for instance, the Craftsman 3D printer, just like a power tool, sold out of, Home Depot, wherever. And then you can pick it up, and might be a locked system or it might be an open system. If they're smart, I think they'll go open. If they're dumb, they'll be locked. That's my personal perspective on that.
Well, I think there's a powerful cultural element here, which none of us have really touched on except vaguely, which is that I think more than almost any other field that I can think of, 3D printing was born out of the hacker-maker movement. Music started out being, it was decentralized, then it kind of got very centralized when the internet was coming along. And the vast majority of people who are doing 3D printing stuff and the ones who are actually building the printers and are doing things with them in business tend to come out of the maker community, not out of the big business community, at least as far as I can tell. So I think that might, over time, bias things a little bit more towards open rather than closed, because the people who are at the cutting edge and building this stuff might be the ones who are more sympathetic towards an open perspective.
You would think so.
Am I wrong?
Well, yes and no. So if you look at the history of 3D printing, it actually started out more than 25 years ago. And so the technology has been around for quite some time. But what happened, of course, was that the patents ran out. And that's why the resurgence has happened now, because a bunch of really smart people at a couple of different universities and other hobbyists decided that they could do this for a fraction of the price. And that's where you get the whole RepRap movement, which is essentially their idea is to create a 3D printer that can print a 3D printer. And so, you get this self-replicating machine, all kinds of cool concepts, but they dropped the prices to $1,300, $1,400 for a 3D printer. And then now what I'm seeing happening is there's a whole new, out of this movement, we had 118 different 3D printing startups, not just 3D printer manufacturers, but other startups just last year alone. That's more than 2 a week. The tech curve is insane right now. And it's super exciting to be a part of, but what we're seeing is that all of these companies are coming up with new tools, new technologies, new services, a whole bunch of new stuff, and a lot of them are patenting things as well, including us. And, we have to, because it's part of the game, and I think we were hearing earlier today as well that, it's an unfortunate game, but it's something that you have to play. And for investors and for defensive measures primarily. But what we're seeing there is that, now I think that there's almost this risk of it flipping back into this closed system if we're not careful. And I think that's where, we are probably, as a company, closer to the maker movement and closer to the idea of open source and open hardware than a lot of the bigger industry players at this point.
It's a Second Amendment question out there, I bet.
Shoot.
Peter, let me use what you just said to make a point. I think, and I was going to ask Chris this. I don't think the First Amendment protects anybody's right to produce a gun without a serial number, if the legislature says you got to have a serial number, any more than my First Amendment right permits me to drive a car without a license plate because I don't like the way they look. It offends my aesthetic sense to have a license plate. No, the state says you got to have a license plate on your car if you want to drive it on the highway. So it seems to me that you acceptable casualties is acceptable within a reasonable regime of organized addressing dangers. I'm not going to accept a world that says guns will not be controlled at all. I'm just not going to accept that world. That's too many acceptable casualties, too many casualties.
Yeah, and I think the difference where I am is that, sure, you can regulate, you can say there has to be serial numbers and registration, but that's the way you keep it off of the technology side is by saying that the acceptable casualties are going to be the people who do not comply with laws that are on the books on the regulatory side. But you keep it off of all of the 3D printers and all of the feed materials in that side, and say that there will be violators of the law.
Right, and I think I'm not sure I would go so far as to say the First Amendment does not apply to the question of printing a serial number on your gun, but it certainly is one where the First Amendment can be satisfied by saying there's a critical government purpose of keeping things safe and tracking down crime, and the implications of speech are narrow. But when you get to, okay, we're going to put this on everything 3D printed because we don't know whether it's a gun or not, suddenly the speech implications are much broader. And that's where the balance may shift from it's okay to regulate guns that are printed as or manufactured as guns by gun manufacturers for sale at gun shows, are licensed and registered and have serial numbers. But we can't require a printer maker to put a serial number on everything that they print because it might be a gun. We can't require everyone who has a design that is a gun to register that with us so that we can then track who downloads it so that we can make sure that they put a serial number on it themselves. There are a lot of ancillary effects on speech that happen when you try to regulate it through the technology instead of just you could certainly say a law that if you 3D print a gun, you must put a serial number on it. I don't think there's a big problem with that. The practicality of that is the question.
Well, I'll go further and say you could have a law that says any design that's created to print a gun, not a component, but whatever the gun is, you define gun any way you want, that design has to have a serial number part of it.
But then if I print a gun here and you print a gun and then someone finds a gun, whose gun is it? You know where the design came from, but you don't know where the
I don't know, but I don't think I've offended the First Amendment by saying you got to put a serial number on your gun design. So we could have debates about where the limits are. My point is, it's not like it's limitless.
No, I don't.
We live in a world where these constitutional rights, all those amendments, interact and create certain reasonable limits.
Right. I think the question is whether there are spaces in where the limits are, where the approaches are reasonable, and the practical effects are beneficial. And that's where I'm not sure that putting a serial number on a design, the challenge there would be, is there a purpose in doing so? Because if there are a million guns and I know which design it's from because I know there's a serial number in the design, what good does that do? What's the benefit to society? Even because you can see the gun, you can tell you can go back and you reverse engineer what design it was.
Then I subpoena your records to see who downloaded your design, and now I've got a list of people to go interview.
If you compel me to keep records.
And I will.
And now you're getting into a much bigger version of it.
I'm gonna be. I think it's undoubtedly true that people who regulate guns will clash with the vision of the ACLU on how far you can go.
Sure, and I think and
the Second Amendment.
Right, and the Second Amendment and the First Amendment and open source, because you can say you must, if you print gun designs, you must track. Okay, well I have a open source project that has a gun design. Who are you going to go after if it's not tracking? It's international. Who are you going to go after? There are lots of practical questions. That's why the First Amendment question is bound in some way by you have to show the purpose is significant, it's actually achieving that purpose, and the limitation and the external effects on speech are limited. And it's difficult in many cases to see where you can do that in the 3D printing world, where you can actually satisfy the whole test in ways that are actually, because you have either it really affects a lot of speech or the practical impact is going to be limited. I don't know that it's impossible. I certainly don't think there's no reason to try, but I'm concerned that a lot of approaches are going to be, well, this is so important, we'll just kind of set the First Amendment aside, or Second Amendment, or whichever one you like.
So let me push this a little bit further, because I think it's a really interesting question to me is, watching some of those videos, and thank you for sharing them, Rory. I've seen most of them before, but
didn't work.
no, but like, I always kind of feel like I'm watching an episode of Jackass whenever I'm watching those videos. But the problem, and my biggest fear, is that that's what's going to shape the dialogue around legislation, is some guy in Texas printing firearms, right? And how do you push back against that?
So you make a video of that kid playing the flute,
Right.
and you show your company manufacturing that thing, and you just send it out to the media and see if anybody bites. And they won't bite until someone is killed with a 3D gun, and then they'll maybe show them both, but still.
Because we're running into stuff already now. So a couple of weeks ago, we lost our product liability insurance, and the reason we lost our product liability insurance was 3D printed guns, which is absolutely ridiculous. And you'll be happy to hear that we now have product liability insurance with an entirely different company. But
They lost business.
but it's hype, but it has real world implications. And I take that pretty seriously, because that's like 24 hours of me having to make phone calls, and I don't like having to do that.
Yeah, and I'd like your call, but that's why I disagree that it's a red herring. I think that it is a real concern, not because 3D guns are a concern, but because 3D printing is cool, and I don't want to see the threat of guns. And I do think, I question whether if there's a shooting, and especially, the worst case scenario would be some kind of school shooting where someone goes past a metal detector with a 3D printed gun and something happens, they're not going to show the flute. It's going to be a story. Someone's going to call for action. We need to do something about this. I think part of the solution is doing this before that happens, talking about where the future of this is, how it's going to be beneficial, and starting to flesh out where we maybe can regulate, so that we don't go into this with this impetus to do something, because that's how you get horrible laws. When you have bad facts make bad laws, and that's as true in the legislature as in the courts.
I almost brought a video clip of In the Line of Fire. It's a 1993 movie with a plastic gun, which everyone said couldn't be done, and then bang, they made that movie. So
Using a spring and plastic molding.
yeah.
So to be clear, we call it a red herring in the sense of, certainly when we started it, the obsession was everyone's looking over here at this one tiny piece of what this technology can do, and that's all we meant.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
It's
It's
a red
important.
herring for us to pick on you for red herring.
No, it's fine. I
It's
don't
we
care.
just disagree with you.
It's a straw man.
It's totally fine. But our main point, if you read the paper, was don't let this run the argument. That would be absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
That's the key.
Yeah, and that's, I think, why this is a good question, because the how do we not let that run the
Right.
argument is, I think, an important one. I think that's more important. We have lots of reasons why it shouldn't, and I think we're all agreed that it shouldn't. But how to make that happen so that some incident doesn't cause bad
Sure.
regulation and constraint that we don't want.
No, as you
Why-
point out,
why we have to.
that's what we do, right? I
Yeah.
mean, look, Snowden, what was part of that? Give a security theater, right? Let's all believe that if we let the government do everything, they'll prevent us from whatever was coming next. This is what we do as a society. As soon as there's a few moments of fear that comes from a real threat, the overcorrection is rather awesome. And that's when I'm hoping that we start to go, look, there's something to be done. There's some type of control that maybe has to be figured out. But let's not go so far over that you've thrown everything out, and you've actually, what we also meant by that was, our assumption in the paper is that perhaps the patent industries that are threatened by this will pull out a couple gun moments, like the Jackass videos, as you called them, to scare people, and have everyone go, oh, look over here, and forget that what was behind that were just unbelievable amounts of great stuff. For instance, given that people are worried about the economy and what's going on, in terms of excess education, as it were, some of the studies out there, the books on this point out that there's a group in Arizona where there's a bunch of people who went to really good design schools, but it turns out there's just not that much demand to make cars. It's a very elite group that gets those jobs. But they're out there designing other things. They now online together crowdsource the design of the cars. They then get together, they get to use their own skills. They actually have some really interesting moments where they go, well, if we did that, we were trying to have a goal of total cost of X, and that thing right there, that's $10,000 or $1,000 or whatever it was. So they redesign, and they come out with something that's almost as cool, but was $100. Now, of course, one of the interesting moments there is under U.S. law, they have to go and assemble the car themselves for safety reasons, or to not be subject to the safety codes. But like, people should know that that's happening, that people are coming up with their own really cool things, rather than focusing on, yes, there are some people who've decided that their cool thing happens to be a gun.
All right. I think that actually, yeah, it's 4:44, 4:43. So, and we were supposed to go to 4:45.
Really?
Excellent.
I just have one last comment, and I think it is this. The Second Amendment issue is actually a lot closer to the flute than you think. Because a lot of people, gun manufacturing for the last, since replaceable parts were invented in the 1880s, so a little bit earlier, it's been very top down, and there's a lot of people who, even if they have the Second Amendment right to defend themselves, there's no way to do it. 3D printers are actually a new system, especially combined with other technologies that people who are missing fingers or prostheses or any sort of special modification is going to allow them to exercise the Second Amendment right when they normally couldn't. So I think that it interfaces with the other arguments.
Seems to me like the take home is that tech is hard when it comes to law, and this is a uniquely powerful representative of that in terms of its promise and also in terms of the potential dangers, because it's got a really, really powerful poster child in 3D printed guns that you can spin almost however you want to. And you've also got stuff like the flute, which is the story that we all want to see on the evening news. And maybe that's where we all come in, right? We just try and do the best we can.
I think the solution is just to make the flute fire breathing or something, and then it's more of a media story. But hardware is hard; it's in the name, so we're prepared to kind of like take the fight. But I do think that it needs to be done proactively rather than reactively, and I'm really happy to see that you guys are kind of, thinking similar thoughts already, and I'd love to take that further in whatever way we can.
Thank you, guys.
Great.